He wasn't always a monster, you know. There was a time he was the love of her life. Happily ever after, they thought. I bet if she could go back, she would say no. You could never truly understand the effect of abuse until you delve into the torment of a victim's eyes. The state of her pupils unwind stained reflections of what was once seen. Unclaimed memories, unfelt emotions. They stick around. They loom in the background. The shadow grows. The color fades. Once a woman, now a corpse. She wonders where her soul went. Will she get it back? What's it gonna take? That's the thing with abuse. It tears you apart, limb by limb. It catches you like a fog, and the colors fade away. She may escape him. He could be hundreds of miles away, but he stole a piece of her, snatched within his fingertips. The fragmented pieces of her soul, all out to one another, all while his looming stench still has her surrounded as she drowns slowly. The main misconception around abusive relationships is that when you're out, you're out, when in reality, the suffering has only just started to take shape. The shadow she's been carrying has been nurtured and watered for years. It signifies his influence, how it's consumed her, the parts of him that have been rubbed off onto her. They don't just go when he goes, they are a part of her now. She made it a part of her identity. The dynamics between an abuser and a victim are always at the core psychologically as to why victims feel so trapped. And as with all relationships, the dynamics are shared, with each side's deep insecurities fueling the tragic mess they have found themselves in. Because trauma is a snowball effect. The more you let it run, the bigger it grows. To look into the psychology of how an abusive relationship works, it has to be understood that both sides naturally take up roles within how they interact and coexist together. These are the building blocks behind the dynamics that tied the souls firmly together, despite the tragedy taking place. The dynamics shared between an abuser and a victim are centered around the roles they've created for themselves. With each role comes identity, fulfillment, and purpose, addicting hooks that latch onto their drowning souls. What they hold onto so tightly only ends up sinking them deeper into their shared abyss. For the abuser, His motives are often rooted in power and desperation to be seen a certain way. His fulfillment comes from relief, as abusers often resort to uncontrollable lashes rather than to confront themselves with their broken reality of the emotional pain they are unwilling to access. It's simply too much to go in depth into their emotions, and so they resort to the instinctive way to deal with them, through an extremely unhealthy and sickening outlet. Victims often blame themselves for their partner's behavior, pointing to their own actions as triggers for the abuse. This couldn't be further from the truth. The real triggers behind an abuser's mind root often in their own severe lacking of functioning ways to handle their own emotions. And so to deflect them away, they violently shove them off, deeply affecting the one that is there to be loved, not destroyed. See, the abuser's actions are rooted in their flaming desperation for power. This could have arisen for many reasons, often the trauma or lifestyle of behaviors throughout childhood. But nonetheless, the constant habit of neglecting how they really feel has nurtured them to regulate their emotions in a way that is uncontrolled. Going back to this outlet constantly has only fed their reliance upon it. For an abuser, power is emotional regulation. It's their way to overcome the emotions, trying to come up above the surface. He drowns them, desperately, seeking power to destroy them. A yearning desire to always be in control. And so to showcase that power, the outlet becomes the unthinkable, to take it out on the one he loves. A desperate quick fix to quieten the inner chaos. A chance to snatch back the sense of superiority. To replace the unbearable vulnerability of the emotions he's never been capable of accessing with the perceived certainty of the power he holds. The anger showcase, the lashing out, it was never a reaction to her. The anger is an instrument, one that he plays to let out what is too much. Nobody can ever be justified in carrying out actions like that. She can never be blamed for such an act of terror. It's the abuser's mishandlement of his own trauma that is the cause. His unwillingness to look himself in the mirror. And so the trauma passes on, because hurt people hurt more people. Abusers are not the strong or confident characters that they portray themselves to be. The image that they put up through their actions and demeanor, it's all just a mask. A mask they protect with everything that they have. They would rather be seen as powerful and intimidating than for who they really are. Untamed, wild animals. Hyperreactive to perceived disrespect. Threatened by the smallest autonomy. The control they latch onto with abuse is not about strength. It's to protect their image, to mask the insecurity, to make sure they are seen and felt, how they want to be seen and felt. Abuse emerges when desperation meets entitlement. It's a delusional coping mechanism to avoid accountability. In reality, it's not just the victim who runs from him, but it's also him running from himself. See, every one of us feel powerless and angry at times, but it's the severe underdevelopment of emotional regulation that pushes him to do what he does. Can't he change it? Well, change threatens the very mechanism that keeps him functional. And so the cycle of patterns run constantly. But it's not just one within this cycle. Both the abuser and the victim are in this together. Change is the scariest thing, and so codependence is formed to cope with this intense lifestyle and avoid change at all costs. Certainty is safety, making the psychological power of an abuser that much more effective in keeping her locked in his power. At the heart of abusive codependent dynamics is the shared fear of psychological collapse. Because the roles that have been nurtured are what is certain to them both. While the abuser regulates themselves through pursuit of control, the victim regulates themselves through attachment, appeasement, and meaning-making. Both are using the relationships to avoid an internal state they cannot handle alone. The roles they play together often reflect what was once seen in childhood, trauma rolling down chapter to chapter. Behind the mask of their behaviors lie the complementary adaptations that each contribute into the dynamics. As you may notice, these factors fit together like a glove, fueling the codependence that can feed their own masking of insecurity and proves the belief systems they fight so hard to protect. Each of their personal coping strategies are reinforced by each other's. The abuser avoids vulnerability through control, while the victim avoids abandonment through compliance, making it seem to both that this is natural when each side feeds into their own subconscious beliefs. Childhood's impact on these subconscious beliefs can never be glossed over. Commonly, the victim resumes the role established in childhood, perhaps previous attempts to seek validation from an authoritative figure. While they might resume that role, it's the abuser who may counter it. Desperation to establish the power they never held as a child. And so within these parallels lies fulfillment in conflicting behaviors. The abuser finds fulfillment in inflicting and sustaining power that he has craved and obsessed over at great lengths, while the victim finds fulfillment in adaptation to danger and the gaps of calm between the acts of suffering. Subconsciously, she sees the abuse as a sign to step up and push to please the unpleasable. A shadow, perhaps, carried over from chapter to chapter in her life. The bond they share may be mutual, but the harm is not. These dynamics mean the relationship meets survival needs for both. Fulfilling, but deeply miserable. As instead of thriving through growth and support for one another, the relationship becomes a game of cat and mouse. A constant cycle of chasing, resting, and repeat. Psychologically entangled, far from morally equivalent. The cat and mouse cycle stands on a twisted premise. Abusive relationships don't hurt all the time. There is a roller coaster ride. High highs, low lows. And so the seesaw swings back and forth. Fear, degradation, and instability turns to relief, affection, and reconciliation, which only then produces hope for the victim that things might get better. When in fact, the cycle runs endlessly when proper addressing doesn't take place. The hook for the victim is found clearly within the relief. In their minds, it's love. The calm feels earned, and since relief never comes without tension, pain feels meaningful. Psychologically, the brain bonds deeper connections and passions to people while under threat and extreme circumstances than it would under steady care. And so with this, we see that it's the intensity of fear and low lows that then create the intensity within the high highs. And so for the victim, relief feels euphoric. The connection feels deeper, and the bond only strengthened. Under this cycle, the dynamics become a structure. The codependence means that certain vital aspects for all functioning beings are dropped due to lack of use and self-neglection. For the abuser, he loses the ability to self-reflect adequately to the behaviors he repeatedly showcases. He is often yet to experience consequence, so why would his brain need to change the behaviors he finds natural? The abuser lacks stabilizing external regulators, and so there is no tunnel for his emotions to be filtered through. Think of a spoiled child, how they react to being told no. Well, when denial is a foreign response and things aren't going how they should be internally, the shame becomes a displaced target aimed at their partner to burst out all frustration. All while the victim has lost the ability for independence as an identity. His choices are the ones that determine his mood, hence her safety. And so why would she rely on her own? His manipulation constantly reminds her that he is right and she is wrong. And so the victim also loses her internal trust in herself, causing her confidence in her own perceptions and even senses at times to deplete. So, with major losses in cognitive functioning, the two rely on each other deeply, and the codependence becomes their shared identity. It's what makes them whole, and so separation threatens psychological freefall, due to each holding the crutches for one another in this twisted entanglement of souls. The identity fusion established creates clear roles for both within how they survive these circumstances. The victim has to monitor constantly to anticipate the abuser's attacks. She is in constant alert, for she knows any moment he can snap. She takes up a mother-like role, attempting to soothe and repair his broken moods. The abuser's role is built around provoking, making sure his dominance is assertive, making sure he is quote-unquote in control at all times. The abuser pursues when they feel a loss of control, while the victim withdraws when overwhelmed. But the moment she pulls away too much, panic begins to set in for the abuser. And so in pursuit of control, things escalate, causing panic for the victim. And so the roles and coping mechanisms are there for both to survive this constant revolving horror show. With this way of living established, it becomes routine. Neither know how to live without it. And so neither is really subconsciously trying to leave it. Because the lifestyle is so drilled into them and hence perceived as safe. They stay despite the misery to avoid internal collapse. Neither of them feel they have the legs to stand alone on. The abuse, in a way, becomes addictive. Victims are sucked into the cycle. They become addicted to the cat and mouse game, the thrills of the ride. They rely on their identities within the relationship to function, and hence become codependent on each other as a result. Separation feels such a distant reality, because it would collapse the very reality they know how to cope through. But how is it that we got to this point in the first place? Well, as said before, the brain bonds more deeply in extreme circumstances. If we look at this neurobiologically, high stress rewires attachment. During these moments of extreme danger or alertness, the brain floods the body with cortisol, a hormone for stress response, while dopamine is released during the relief to the abuse. And the reconciliation sees oxytocin released. A neurological roller coaster of one emotional hormone to the next. And so the rapid journey from fear to relief to closeness creates accelerated bonding, as all three stages are at the hand of the abuser. It creates a hooking cycle that the victim knows only he can provide, while it also feels like the surviving is being done together. They have something in common that no one else understands. A similar process of closeness found in trauma bonding or Stockholm syndrome, or even cult attachment and extremist religious groups. To her, he is irreplaceable in a twisted and psychologically complex way. Alternative relationships could never offer the kind of thrilling roller coaster that he can. And so in many cases, survivors of abuse who are out of the relationship find themselves attracted to outlets that mimic that kind of pain in order to maintain the cycle when they have no abuser to provide it for them. Let's zoom in on one of these factors and look at the psychology behind self-harm and why victims of abuse and trauma find themselves so attracted to it. The paradox of self-harm actually relates similarly as to why abusers commit harm to the ones they love. Self-harm in itself is a quick fix to pull the curtain over the emotional pain they subconsciously reject. Remember what we already established: safety is felt in what is known, while the unknown is left to be feared. So what happens when physical pain is far more familiar than emotional pain? It becomes the go-to choice in these tragic circumstances. When the emotional pain has been severely deprived, which is in many cases the case for victims of abuse, it feels bottomless. It feels threatening to identity and the very mask they themselves have put up. And it feels shame-inducing. A common mask for victims is for them to act like the actions of the abuser don't affect them, using that as an anchor for strength. And so they perceive emotions as weakness, meaning when the emotion approaches, they will do anything to suppress it and to maintain the mask. The emotional pain is just too much. On the contrary, through often years of experience handling physical pain, it is that becomes familiar, contained, and survivable. That way, when emotional pain tries to come to the surface, the nervous system desperately clings onto something it can handle. The self-harm acts as a relief for the emotional pain, a relief that can so easily fall into addiction. And so from a distance, we can see that the coping mechanisms of both the victim and the abuser run parallel to each other. They both directly harm the victim as a means to run from the deeper, more complicated emotional issues. The quick fix emotional relief is as a result of drastically unhealthy outlets. Another piece to this deeply saddening reality of why self-harm becomes addictive is that within it being a substitute for the abuse cycle, both in pain and relief, it can become a freeing experience subconsciously to deal with the trauma on their own terms. When people endure prolonged trauma or abuse, they are enduring something that was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and relational. It came at the hand of someone else. And so in contrast to that, self-harm can feel so liberating as it completely flips each of these factors on their heads. The attraction isn't necessarily the pain, but in the liberating sense of control, something so foreign to victims of abuse and others struggling overall. This control that it gives creates the perception that it's a freeing act, while pushing away the real and sometimes hardest antidote to let in on ourselves: love. If you are someone who struggles with self-harm, I want you to know that it's not your fault. You aren't broken. You are just subconsciously trying to survive what can be so overwhelming. I want you to know that you deserve to be loved, not just by others, but by yourself, unconditionally, for the amazing and unique person that you are. Treat yourself with patience, even when it's hard, and let your emotions become something that is celebrated and not kept in a cage. To overcome the fear and anxiety, all the pain, you shouldn't fight what is trying so hard to heal you. Nurture your emotions, step by step, and let the flower inside you bloom and shine bright once again. For a victim of abuse, leaving the relationship doesn't just mean losing the person. It means losing the role, the narrative, and the purpose that comes within the dynamics. A major loss, all things considered, since these things were the backbone of what was relied upon for all those traumatic years. And so for a survivor of abuse, attention to such trauma is needed. They enter a grieving process, a drowning process. Many after safety sink or don't know how to handle a whole new life. They feel overwhelmed, crazy, and an urgent sense of displacement. Steps need to be taken to get through this as a victim, as they enter an isolated battle of complex psychological nature. It's a battle against herself to transition from the woman she was to the one she is to become. We move now to the drowning process, where this grief experienced by survivors feels extremely uncomfortable. The silence is deafening. There is no need to be on constant alert anymore. And so the victim has to learn to deal with that dramatic shift in their lives. The grief feels destabilizing and disappropriate at times, as emotions flare out over someone who caused such tragedy. In simple terms, the grieving process is the nervous system catching up to all the unfelt emotions and trauma that was left in the past. Because during abuse, feeling the full emotional effects of such impact would have simply been too much, And so the psyche prioritizes survival over emotional feeling. If the grief would be experienced during survival, the brain knows it would lead to collapse. So the emotions are pushed away, often leaving victims numb to their emotions and unable to access them. That way, when it's quiet again on the outside, the space opens up internally for the floodgates of emotion to pour out. And so they do, all at once. The loss is undeniable. The fantasy collapsed. The victim is grieving everything, all at once. Let's start off with the abuser themselves, because the victim is left to grieve them in many different ways. The first aspect is grief of the one that they used to be. The simple and tragic fact is that the abuser wasn't always bad. The one she chose to marry wasn't the monster that forced divorce. He held traits that were loving and built her to attraction and relationship in the first place. And so reflection on the man he once was brings such pain in the way she misses that person that is now lost. While at the same time, when wondering where that person went, victims often blame themselves for causing such change and rage to consume him. The blame is deception. It couldn't be further from the truth. The victim's grief returns to the hopeful side of perspective. They look back often with rose-tinted glasses, a stance they often held during the abuse as well. During the relief phases of the cycle, the good side of the abuser often returns in flashes. A true tragedy, a false sense of hope. During this time, the hope is another coping mechanism, fueling their persistence in the relationship. And so when the plug is pulled, it's not just the man that is sucked down, but that hope is also burst with him, all while the victim stands with blood on her hands, knowing she was the one who ended it. The hardest thing is to let go. To give up what took everything to survive in, to kill all the hope, the desperation that he would change. It's like he's being drowned, and hence a piece of you dies too. This is the perception for survivors of abuse, and the constant mental battle in their heads. It's a struggle few will understand. And so it becomes one often felt in isolation, as those around her struggle to understand why she misses someone who hurt her so deeply. Adding to that, it's not just him she has to grieve. It's the relationship dynamic and meaning it poured into her life. After all, abusive relationships are extremely intense. The thrills of the roller coaster result in emotional saturation, while the role she played became so ingrained and integral that it became her identity. And so the intensity and passion of that must also be grieved. In many cases also, when abuse survivors jump into a follow-up relationship, they perceive the healthiness as quiet, which the traumatized system reads as absence. There is a large amount of passion felt in reminiscing the relationship. The passion is backed up by illusion. Illusion that abusive relationships create of exclusivity, a closed world only experienced by the two partners. They are the only ones let into this fantasy they have created, and so only they understand it, creating a passionate feeling of alignment. This feeling of feeling irreplaceable enhanced the passion due to the extreme circumstances. For the survivor, this perceived purpose gave pain status, and so the fallout often produces feelings of worthlessness, knowing everything that she was is now gone. And so, in the absence of purpose, doubt creeps in. She's not in denial of the situation. It's attachment mourning, another coping mechanism to deflect the confronting nature of the situation. Attempts from the brain once again to contain the reality of what happened into something digestible. Because the truth is, it was that bad. And so the fantasy is collapsed. All the sacrifice is revealed as in vain. And now the victim must grieve all the wasted love and effort towards someone who responded with only pain and damage. A lot. Too much. So the brain tries to preserve coherence, to protect itself from the overwhelming shame, grief, and identity rupture. And so the victim feels a pull towards him again, a fight within her own mind. Though she has left him, the soul tie remains, fueled by her own instinct, helped also by her lack of clarity when reminiscing the traumatic memories. When abuse breaks a soul down layer by layer, it doesn't just violate the trust between her soul towards loved ones and others around her, it also destroys the trust for herself through internal conflicts, making her second guess who was the villain in their story. Part of that conflict comes from distorted memory loss and tragic instability on how she values the boundaries being violated. With abuse being inconsistent and invisible from the outside perspectives in most instances, the victims stand alone in this battle of grief due to no perceived outlets of people who could understand this life held behind closed doors. This leaves them to their own thoughts to regulate and judge what happened. And when this is up to devices that are hypnotized by the seductive scent of familiarity, they often look back at the abuse as being normal, while at the same time, more coping mechanisms from the brain often fog memories entirely to try to withhold the full truth. That's why urges to go back can be so strong, as the instability of a new life produces cravings of what is familiar. All the doubt produced by the brain is a masked attempt to cover up the severity of the truth. The question, was it really that bad, when stripped down to its core, is revealed as, can I survive the truth if I admit it was? As with the truth comes confrontation, that all the walls that were her life's work have now come crashing down. As survivors are hit with oncoming waves of grief, another follows. As victims find themselves grieving the abuse itself, not because they wanted it, but because it organized their way of life within the cycle. It gave structure, purpose, urgency, and a role within it all, a clear path with clear goals, certainty. When this is all lost, the victim faces a frightening emptiness of vast, unstructured space. She has freedom without regulation, identity without instruction, and so she doesn't know how to handle what is so new to her. The grief of the role she had poses questions of who she is without it. The purposes she had, all sucked in a vacuum. And so she asks herself what remains. The role provided the sense of being essential. It provided identity through suffering, and the meaning that made the pain survivable. And so questions arise, statements follow, and when shared as desperate hope for support, miseducated judgment often returns. Supporting a survivor can also be hard, especially when you care so deeply. But steps back need to be taken to see what they are actually grieving. Missing the role doesn't mean they wanted or liked the abuse. The real loss is the identity and lifestyle structure that became their nature over the course of the relationship. And so to heal from this takes big steps of rewiring what has been so deeply drilled in. It requires acceptance and finding peace in recognizing what happened. It means separating what was real from what was adaptive, honoring the strength without glorifying the suffering, and building and restoring purpose to the person that you were, rather than the bond as your identity. Victims don't necessarily grieve the deception of abuse. They grieve because they invested their entire soul into surviving something that never deserved them. And so the grief is the reclaiming of the truth. When mourning the fantasy that was up during the abusive relationship, the self that lived within it is gone too. So the victim not only has to live in what feels like a new world, they need to fully rediscover what makes them them without it. And the first introduction to this new world that she now has to live in is waves of grief of the one that has passed. Attempts to drown her while she is still learning to swim, all while several painful realizations are made. The soothing words and promises held so closely to her heart turned out to be false. The belief that her endurance would reap reward shattered. And perhaps the most tragic, the painful realization that the person she was before the abuse, her innocence, her trust, has all been damaged so severely, and her identity has paid the price. Rebuilding can be the hardest phase, but I want you to know that it will all be worth it. I want you to know how strong you are to overcome what you had. You are not lost. This is a delicate phase, a natural phase of recovery to rebuild what's been torn apart. A wounded animal has to be nurtured back to health. So give yourself time, give yourself space, give yourself love. To learn to be yourself again, you must first unlearn who you had to be. Release the grip on what's been held on for so long. Learn to trust yourself again. You don't need to survive anymore. Let go. Let go of all the processes. Your hyper-responsibility for others and their emotions. Your identity built on suffering endurance. Your belief that safety comes from managing people and constantly watching for sudden movements. Your reflex to justify or over-explain your boundaries. Let them all go. You don't need them anymore. Drop your guard. You are safe. It's all going to be okay. You don't have to look over your shoulder. You don't have to second guess every detail, every action. The coast is clear. You are free. It's a process. Take your time. Turn back each layer with care, with love, because you deserve that. You can rest now. When identity is lost and the color of a once bright soul is faded, the question lingers, what remains? When victims of abuse find themselves away from the tension and danger of a lifestyle so drilled into them, they reflect on the collapse that has taken place. The emotions come out of her shell. The numbers turns to floodgates. Safety in the physical world brings unrest in the emotional one, as everything that was unfelt begins to catch up to her. In the shock of it all she can do is question herself, her identity. Her self-worth, her purpose. These questions produce self-prescribed answers of severe depression, dissociation, and emptiness. A painful void, as the victim is caught in transition between the person she was and who she is to become. Her entire identity needs to be reorganized. The wires that have held her together her whole life must be untangled and replaced. Her identity was functional, for it was built to survive the most dark circumstances. But when the environment is taken away, the identity and survival instincts no longer serve her and only create unsustainable paranoia in safe circumstances, as the stillness is met with sheer confusion. And so, in this void, the grieving process begins. Non-linear, unpredictable, a different kind of grief. The grief of a survivor. It comes in stages, 9 to be exact, as the victim has to relive all her trauma in order to rediscover her colors and become whole once again. The process happens step by step as space opens up in her mind to access these reflections. If they came all at once, it would be too much. So the nervous system releases material gradually, sending waves to sweep at her. The first stage marks a feeling of excitement, relief. She's safe now, and the lifestyle of constantly looking over her shoulder must now come to an end. Freedom has been achieved, and deep, calm breaths can now be taken. All the fear is dropped in what seems like an instant. Euphoria commences as she feels the weight has been taken from her shoulders. The victory dance is accompanied by a bright smile, and hope for a prosperous future and a fresh start takes over her starry eyes. The worst is over, she says. The relief is not happiness, it's the absence of threat. She didn't realize the tension she was in until she was out of it. My brain finally has the time to address it. The feeling of relief is the calm that follows emergency, not stability. Adrenaline decreases. The sympathetic nervous system, responsible for the fight or flight reactions, becomes disengaged. The nervous system realizes it's unthreatened during the stage, but it is far from being regulated. Stage 2 brings forth a shadow, blockading her emotions with a fog. The fog brings emotional flatness, dissociation, severe difficulty accessing memories and feelings, and a strange neutrality towards what happened. The emotional numbness is a protective shutdown as the brain feels it's too much to handle, and so it freezes, dampening its emotional processing, suppressing limbic activity, which is neurologically responsible for emotional and memory regulation, which directly influences how we respond to and process our experiences. And so when the brain cuts it off, the feeling is inaccessible, The brain sends its numbing agent to ensure protection of itself for now. At this stage, the system knows it cannot go through all the feelings at once, leaving the victim reaching for feelings that have dissolved in the air. Stage 3. Rage brings intense anger as the victim's eyes have been opened. The realization produces extreme anger that they project in multiple trajectories. The rage is often the first real emotional truth to break through, as the victim holds anger, moral outrage, bitterness towards the abuser for their actions, also towards others, people around her who didn't help or couldn't see. The anger is also directed towards themselves. Self-blame commences as they interrogate why they let this happen and why they didn't leave sooner. Neurologically, amygdala activation increases part of the brain responsible for detecting danger and emotional processing. With this activation, the stored threat memory becomes accessible, exposing the victim to the confronting truth that she was brutally abused. These intense feelings crucially only come to light in safety. This is because it was too dangerous to feel while in the relationship. Expressed rage would have threatened danger, and so the anger is not regression, it's reclaimed agency. Flipping the accessible emotions completely on their heads, this new stage brings intense feelings of cravings for the abuser. It's the most misunderstood stage, obviously, as people around her will ask why she misses someone who hurt her so deeply, often bringing shame from close ones. In this stage, the victim begins to grieve the abuser. Victims in this stage are craving the version of the abuser who appeared in reconciliation, when he was kind, loving, helpful, as opposed to destructive. The moments of softening, remorse, and intimacy, the hope that it gave her, that birthed possibility for greener grass together. Hope that she held on to, for it gave her strength to carry on with him. The brain was conditioned to bond with intermittent safety, which would strengthen the reliance on it over time, making the cruelty excused and overlooked. And so during the stage, those feelings returned towards him, producing internal questioning within her mind. Doubt, shame, guilt, all products of this deeply confusing state, all emotions that were usually regulated by the abuse. Well, now she is left to deal with it all on her own, making cravings even more intense, as the unfamiliarity of standing alone creates intense longing for what is familiar. The victim at this stage is grieving the relationship, for it was the meaning that gave towards her suffering, the intensity, and the feeling of being needed, producing dopamine circulations and oxytocin releases to trigger bonding sensations and deep emotional longing for what has been beaten into her. Following directly the intense feelings of longing comes one of the most painful stages, doubt, as victims are left with their judgments severely clouded. Their feelings produce thoughts. They doubt themselves, they doubt their memories, their interpretations, and whether it was their right to leave. This stage occurs because in their minds, the abuse is still not fully recognized or accepted, which when combined with their longing for the abuser, creates the intense doubt in the absence of clarity. Clarity that is so hard to access because of how confronting it is. It takes time to fully accept the abuse, because fully accepting the abuse means acceptance of the fact that it was real, unjustified, and that it has deeply affected them. Extremely uncomfortable and confronting realities to process. So the mind has to give it in doses and dim down the intensity to lessen the pain. A temporal fix to buy more time. But in its absence, it forms confusion of the direction she is going in. With the dimming itself, the brain minimizes trauma to reduce stress. Memory reconciliation blurs out the extremes of what happened. And so the attachment circuits, so used to caring and being with the abuser, still remain and compete with her consciousness for control. The mentioned absence of clarity reveals itself in the next stage. As victims are confronted with the truth, the mask is pulled off, only tears remain. The victim recognizes the events that have occurred. This clarity becomes healing, despite how confronting it is. The victim's reflection clears the fog. The cycle she has been a slave to begins to make sense. The self-blame decreases. The anger narrows and becomes more precise. The reality becomes stable as victims realize they are away from what happened. But the self remains unstable as they realize she is built to survive in a reality that is no longer there, creating a paradox of realizing she was abused. This paradox collapses the very reality she's had to stand on for years, unveiling it before her very eyes. The very nature of desperation and survival kept them functional. But now it's no longer needed, and so clarity brings stability in certain areas. There is no coherence as the reality becomes acceptable once processed. The self-blame is dropped and replaced with acceptance of themselves and their situation. The confusion of fog is replaced with clear skies of vision. However, intense winds come in as they realize the length of the task ahead. On the contrary to all of this, comes the dropping of the fantasy that fueled persistence within the relationship. The very intense coping mechanisms that were held onto desperately. Excuses used to protect sanity and shield the pain. It all comes crashing down as clarity pulls the plug on her optimistic beliefs and exposes abuse for the disgusting violation that it is, leaving victims in a void to pick up the pieces of her broken soul, leaving her with a severe sense of meaninglessness and emotional freefall. The victim loses someone real in her ex-partner, but also someone imaginary in who she thought he was. The clarity stage requires holding two truths simultaneously. meaning victims must accept the fact that that person she loved didn't exist as she believed him to. A realization deeply destabilizing. The relationship was built on potential, not reality. Her fantasy of that was held so intimately in her heart. She fell in love with it. She couldn't survive without it. And so letting go feels like killing hope itself, drowning a part of her soul, leaving her in a state of deep instability as she is tasked to grieve all of the loss. She must learn to let go of the role that organized her identity and the purpose within that. Her worth used to be measurable through sacrifice. It was determined by him and his actions. Her identity was structured around it, no matter how painful it was. And so, with clarity comes identity destabilization. A void left by the absence of what gave her purpose, and no seen direction on where to go to for help. The old identity collapses before the new one is formed, while at the same time, clarity is perhaps the harshest phase, as painful realizations are made. See, clarity doesn't just expose the abuser, it also exposes just how much the victim gave. All the chances given, all the heart she showed, all the tears. A beautiful rose, innocent, loving, built to give, was neglected, starved, bruised, pushed away, over and over again. When the colors faded, the petals fell. He stole a piece of her, all while she lined up with more to give. Haunting realizations of the amount of personal boundaries that were crossed, realizations of just how much they minimized themselves for someone who spat in their face as response. The moral injury of these realizations produces shame, self-hate, and grief as two realizations combine. This takes time to digest. The attachment is gone, but there is no replacement, leading to quick fixes in the absence of what regulated their emotions. But the grief needs time and care to resolve these scars, despite desperation for the unbearable pain to pass. Neurobiologically, dopamine and oxytocin is replaced by cortisol spikes, trading purpose and bond for uncertainty at this stage. The victim is alone with these issues, often craving what is familiar, but to move on in a healthy manner, she must find a new way to live. Without abuse, she again questions her purpose. Anxiety, emptiness, and panic plague her mind, as clarity and realization reveal how damaging the situation was, closing the door on the hope she held previously. All that's left is confrontation. It forces grief without hope of revision. It means the past cannot be redeemed. The clarity removes the confusion that was used as a numbing tool. And so this is where emotions become deeply intense. It makes the situation way more personal. The pain cuts deep as she realizes it was all real. It hurts so deep, but it's the indicator for healing to commence. As victims begin to come to terms with it all, step by step, feeling it all heals the trauma within, addressing it, comforting it, nurturing what has been broken, and replacing what led to abuse with a new way of living, a new identity, something that takes time, care, and attention. During this phase, victims are in an awkward transition state between the old way of life, fueled by coping mechanisms and desperation to survive, and the new way, which hasn't been developed yet. And so, this feels deeply destabilizing from within her perspective, because the clarity has dismantled the meaning before it can be replaced. It's removed the attachment before new forms of regulations have been formed. It exposes the loss in full force, meaning the pain is unbearable. It ends illusion without establishing safety, and it forces identity reconstruction while mid-grief, making the grieving process of abuse that much more layered and tragic and overwhelming. The clarity is so destabilizing, not because it's harmful, but because it tells the truth faster than the nervous system can handle, meaning there is no lead out. The victim is hit all at once. It's not a breakdown, however. It's structural demolition of the roots that have been so deeply ingrained before rebuilding can take place. There is so much to digest. There is so much to feel. It all takes time. Stability hence returns by building a self that no longer needs illusion to survive. The identity needs rebuilding, brick by brick. The emotions need to be felt, layer by layer. Rooting directly from the clarity stage comes collapse. Victims are overwhelmed by what has been exposed to them. They become depressed, exhausted, unmotivated, empty, and deeply confused by their identity. These feelings are rooted from grieving the role they once had. Being the fixer meant being needed. Being central to someone else's survival meant having a clear purpose. It wasn't just a relationship, it was a clear function. But now, it's all gone, and the victim collapses into a pit of sadness. The collapse is a result to loss of meaning, leaving the nervous system in a state of low energy, and the body can now rest after prolonged hyperarousal and intensity. This stage is post-survival fatigue, as things have begun to set in. The 8th stage brings resilience as the dust begins to settle and the trauma has been processed. Self-trust is built again after years of mistrust. Boundaries once broken down again and again begin to feel possible, and a quiet sense of agency begins to form. The love has now been rebuilt, and she starts to feel normal again. The mind feels clearer and more at peace, a stable foundation that she can now build from. A brighter flower can now grow. Stage 9, the final stage, the final push. It brings a new perspective that all previous stages have led towards. It's somber, it's quiet, it's tragic, as the victim realizes how much they have lost. So much was taken so ruthlessly, and she has a deeper reflection on it all. The wider perspective from the extensive processing reveals more loss. It shifts the priority of what matters, as she realizes she's not who she used to be. The grief settles in and becomes a quiet silence, as she pays tribute to who she was before the abuse. A quiet grief, completing the cycle, calming the storm.